Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
1 second, sorry. Okay, opening government cannot win this debate until they prove why some changes might happen on their side of the house. Because even though these people might not publicly display their face, it still doesn't mean that the stereotypes disappear. People seeing other person with Arabic appearance will still think that he is a Muslim, and therefore all the stereotypes that opening government described will be applied to him symmetrically. So on our side, we at least have the chance of this changing, which is actually is a good case for these people. So we are going to talk about 3 things. Firstly, why we think that people and all the society will going to change their behavior and change and destroy the stereotypes, change their minds towards these people. Secondly, why we still deprive people of religious of their identity and why it is important. And thirdly, why we get these communities more radicalized and how it also influences the society. So firstly, on how people do change their behavior. There are 3 mechanisms here. When we get this, their face publicly displayed, when they wear burqas, when they wear hijabs, when they, pray publicly or do stuff like that. So the first one is the communication that is required for you. So people live in the society and they communicate with each other a lot because they have a lot of stuff to do together. So your kids coming to school together, or you meet your other parent at parental meetings. You meet people at shops, you meet them in hospitals, you meet them on playgrounds. These are all the ways that you can start interacting with these people. And so it is important that your cooperation with these people is based on you knowing that they're displaying the Muslim faith, because this is the way that you can start actually communicating with these people on this type of thing. But moreover, like while you'll be communicating with them, you will interacting, you will understand that they are regular people. Even though she or this person wears a hijab or burqa, it doesn't mean that she is bad because she helped your kid with the school job or something like that. Or your kids were playing together at the playground and everything was good. So which means that this is the first way that people change their mind when they see that these people are good, and the fact that they wear hijab or something like that doesn't make them evil. Secondly, is that people, when they meet these things every day, they get used to it. This is the overtone window thing. When you see that people are praying every day, and after this public prayer, they just simply go back to work or back to home with smiles on their face, you get used to it because they're not doing anything evil. They're just praying. They're not killing anyone. They're not saying that you have to kill anyone or something like that. So which means that you day over days get used to how they look like, what they're doing, it becomes something not special for you. But thirdly, if people are not wearing the hijabs and not publicly displaying their face, it's still less likely that you're going to start the dialogues about that, because you might think that he's not that kind of a religious person because he doesn't wear this stuff. When they're publicly wearing this, you are likely to start asking them questions. Why? Tell me about your religion. Tell me about the postulates of your religion. And most likely that these people are going to tell you the truth. They're going to say that actually the Muslim, for instance, people, they are this is a completely good religion, that it's not an evil religion. We have great postulates that say that we have to help people. And therefore, these are the 3 mechanisms of communication which actually change the perception of the people, which doesn't happen when people are not wearing publicly these hijabs. Second case that we want to talk about is the deprivation of identity. You have to note that wearing burqas, hijabs, or something like that in other religions, it's very important part of religion of these people, because this is what Allah said, or the God said to you. You have to wear this in order to praise me. This is a good type of behavior that you have to pursue. And so if you are not doing it every day, if you are showing your hair, for instance, publicly, it means that you violate the word of the Allah. And if you violate the word of the Allah, it doesn't mean, it means that you are not like doing everything good. It means that you're doing bad stuff. It means that it makes you, it prevents you from coming to heaven, because it's in some sort of a way a sin. So which means that people feel miserable, people feel like a bad person because they cannot do what the God said to them. So it we believe that it's something that these religious leaders cannot prevent and deprive people of doing, because opening government even didn't prove why it is their obligation to not only to study them a religious some postulates, but also to define the way that these people live. Because we think that imam's role, for instance, is to guide you, but not to say to you what have you do in your life. Because imams are only helping you in the prayer, they're not guiding you everywhere in your life. Before I continue, closing.
Just to be clear, is your stance to actively encourage them to be able to publicly display their faith, or what other alternatives do you have to tell them, these people, instead?
We think our stance is to be mediocre at that. So we're gonna say that if you want to publicly display your faith, that's good. If you don't want to do it, it's your choice. You can choose not to do that if you feel like it's a normal good stuff for you. So third argument is the radicalization. So we think that these minority groups might also radicalize because of two mechanisms. Firstly, because they think like they're being deprived of their personality, of their values, because they're not being able to publicly display their face. And as I already explained to you, it is very important thing for these people that were raised and born inside of these religious postulates and were told that this is a good thing to follow. But secondly, the fact that we are depriving people of this right only for the minority religions. So the big religions like Christianity will still be able to publicly display their faith because we're not prohibiting that. And therefore people are gonna think like why they're allowed to do that, why they're allowed to show their face and we are not, probably because they want to discriminate us, they don't want to see us in the society. We think it makes these interactions worse, as people don't want to interact with each other because they think that they are not welcome in this society. For these reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker and invite the DLO to present their case. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. So answers to questions done to us by OG. First, why interaction actually takes place? 2 reasons for that. You inevitably interact in daily life. You need to go to shop and buy something from the seller who is a Muslim or a Jew. You need to go to school and meet your classmate there who can be of different religions, because OG is right when they say that a lot of immigrants came to Europe during recent years. You go to work and see people of different religion there and interact with them inevitably, because you have to in all the basic stuff that you do throughout your day, meaning that communication and interaction happens on our side of the house. They say people won't communicate with you because they are conservative. However, OG is just generalizing things when they say that all people in Europe are conservatives. Of course, there are some radical right powers that can exist on their side of the house and on our as well. However, we believe that majority of people are quite mediocre in their views because they are afraid of being radical and they do not see any reason to be radical. Therefore, the probability that you would communicate with someone who is Muslim or is a Jew on your workplace or in school are much higher on our side of the house. And why it is important to have religious religious symbols on you or to show your faith publicly in these cases, because only when you show that you is affiliated with this religion, you show to people that there is a link between being a good person on a workplace and being a good Muslim, meaning that the stereotype that this person can possess, or the stereotype that can be put on this person through social media and through other stereotypical types of way, they are not correct, and these stereotypes are being broken in the people's head, and they now can resist to all this bad stuff that is told about minority religions in Europe. And this is the way how communication actually leads to a better perception of all of the minority religions and to better assimilation of these people inside Europe. Second point, religious leaders can interpret religion, and people won't feel as sinners when they won't have this religious public. We believe that it is very hard to interpret why you should be a second-tier religion within the country you live in, because what these leaders would need to say is that Christians have a right to wear some religious symbols on their clothes and publicly, but you do not have the right to do so because we do not want you to be endangered. This means that you make people believe that that religion they believe in is worse and the second tier, and you make people mad at it, or at least deprived of their identities and personalities. And we believe that, and we think that people would either do not believe this religious because it is strange when Imam says that Islam is worse than Christianity, or they will be confused and wouldn't know where to believe and how to act. And taking into account, they would think about their afterlife and the fact that they need to do something good in order to be good to Allah, in order to go to the paradise. They would still feel that they need to wear burqas or any other stuff in order to be good person and good faith. Third point, illegal stuff that can happen throughout Europe, like for example, forbidden wearing burqas. Of course, illegal stuff is out of this debate, because if it is illegal on our side of the house, this means it is illegal on yours, and the religious leaders do not need to do anything about that in order to make people less endangered. And of course, they wouldn't tell them wear burqas despite the fact that it is illegal. However, we believe that the change here is that if we agree that something religious can be illegal and something can be prohibited, this means that all these right radicals and neo-Nazis on OG side of the house comes and continue prohibiting all religious symbols and stuff that can be important for these people from public display or just from pursuing, making life of these people miserable, like Roman has already explained to you. Fourth point, how radicalization, what is the delta of radicalization? So first, we believe this means that people would avoid public places and communication with the majority of other majority religious people, because they would know that they need to hide something there, and they would know that they need to be sinners when they go to public. This will make them close in their neighborhoods and communities, decrease the number of communication they have with people of other religions, meaning that all communication and interaction happens less on site OG. This means that majority now have no opportunity to think about a Muslim as of a good person, or about a Jew as a good person, meaning that there is less opportunity to decrease the impacts of stereotypes that happens on that side of the house. The second impact, there is just worse assimilation of these people in Europe. They came from different communities, they came from communities that had different rules, but they need to get used to how this world works. However, now when they know that they would be rejected in any community that they go to, for example, they wouldn't go to a debate club in some European university, because they would know that in case they would wear a burqa there or hijab there, people would think that they are bad, because they would perceive that if my leader says that I need to decrease the number of religious symbols on me in order to feel good at the majority community, this means that these people don't like when I wear these symbols. Therefore, I would be just afraid to go to these communities, meaning that all the interaction happens also less on their side of the house. And this means, A, more violence from majority people toward this stuff, because now it is very hard to resist to all these outright people who would say that most Muslims are bad and we need to do something about the degrees of these people in Europe, because you wouldn't be able to compare the good people and bad people, because you wouldn't see that these good people coming to you because they would be afraid of yours. And second is more violence from community itself, because they would feel that they need to protect themselves and their faith, and this makes these people more radical and their resistance towards all the actions and prohibiting burqas more violent on their side of the house. This means that the peaceful negotiation between majority and minority religion would never happen on their side of the house. And if they put life saviors role on them, they fail it, and we ask you to vote all.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech and invite the member of government to present the case. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, great. All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. How do we extend from OG? Two things. Number one, I think there's very little discussion on the context of Europe and why this is precisely the reason for discrimination. Secondly, they're unable to weigh this against the benefit of religion that I think opening opposition points out. I will explain why religion is practiced far better on our side of the debate. Two things. Number one is, what is the context of Europe? I think this is important to explain because it rebuts what O says about change and rebuts also CO's POI on contact theory and getting more exposure. I.e., they say exposure in itself is good because you understand this religion better. I disagree. Exposure and contact theory only occurs if the interactions are good and productive, if they are likely to ask, what is that thing about your religion? How do I learn more about your people and your culture? As opposed to incredibly discriminatory and unproductive forms of interaction that I think are far more likely on our side, or rather on their side of the house. So why is it that it is precisely public professions of faith that creates these stereotypes, that creates incredibly antagonistic discourse? I want you to look at the context of Europe. What is the rhetoric that people like Geert Wilders, that Alternative for Deutschland, use whenever they try and go against immigration policies? Three things. Firstly, that it is an attack on nationalism, and it is precisely the public nature of the profession that makes you feel like they are imposing their culture upon you, that wherever you look, they are changing what it means to be German, that they are changing what it means to be French, because these are the values that people share and they are rubbing it in your face. Secondly, that they're swarming you, that they are invading your country, because of the large scale of migrants that have come in since 2016, it is the feeling that they're closing in on you and you have to defend yourself within this culture. And most notably, it is the public nature of that practice that makes people feel more and more antagonized and isolated and alienated from their own nation. But thirdly, it is a bipartisan consensus. So while I agree it's largely a far-right movement, there's even agreement from left-wing parties for the reason that they say that Islam and multiple forms of public professions are regressive, that it is things like the burqa that has set the feminist movement back for many years, and therefore we ought not give them any help because they are going against our freedoms and our rights. So this then rebuts the claim for productive interaction. In fact, I would argue that it significantly decreases the propensity for a lot of these arguments to be made, insofar as you cannot claim that they're imposing their values upon you anymore when it is a private practice in nature. They are respecting and doing their own culture within their own boundaries. So they're not forcing it and pushing it onto you. And I'd argue in terms of change, that is a far better way to be able to ensure that there's future political will for these things to occur and more protection for these groups of people. So I want to ask then, how do we get productive forms of interaction? Because I think opening government takes a very worst case scenario, i.e. that you will have entirely closed off communities, that they will never have a source of interaction. I think what I'm going to do instead is to flip a lot of the OO mechanisms that you can interact with people in schools, you can interact with people on a daily basis. But what is the reason that interaction is far more likely to be good on our side? The first thing I want to note is that it's just much more likely to happen because a lot of the time, because of the ties of Islam to extremism, onto terrorism, etc., you're more likely to pull people out of these sources of interaction. I.e., if a parent sees their kid trying to make friends with their classmate who wears a burqa, it's much more likely you say, don't do that. That kid is dangerous. Don't do that. You should not be friends with that kid because they are a bad influence. I would argue in the instance that there are no clear identifiers of people's religions, it's much more likely the other positive ways that you're able to get to know about them that opening opposition says, that they are a good student, that they're a good friend, that they are people you can interact with on a daily basis before being able to know about the religion. That's when you're far more likely to be receptive about the nature of that religion, as opposed to knowing about the religion first. But the public nature of that profession makes it such that the visible identifiers make it easier for people to pull out of these sources of discussion and interaction as a whole. Why is that important then? I'd argue it's far more likely to increase the capacity for productive change on our side of the house. But lastly, I would also note that it is the inability for people to understand cultural nuances such that they're much more likely to act in self-defense because they might feel it is a terrorist attack when someone acts in, for example, as a public profession of their faith. I'd argue it is important to be able to create distinctions from the most visceral, the most notable acts of public faith, like acts on terror, like multiple different extremist acts, that I would argue have been incredibly negative, not just because they happen, but also because they have created incredibly large stereotypes on different groups of people. In the instance that you can identify as a group that does not support these acts, and therefore you're unwilling to be able to engage with them as a whole, I'd argue it's far easier not to be labeled as a terrorist organization or people who are a danger to society at large. Secondly, why is the religious experience better? And I think opening government is unable to be able to weigh this claim. The first thing I want to note is that opening opposition's claim that people will feel like they are sinning is based on two things. Number one, I'd argue people already feel like they are sinning because if you are unable to act in public professions of your faith, you feel like you've abandoned your religion. Second, you feel like you are ashamed of your religion, that you're not willing to be as good as the person next to you is willing to act in public profession. Or thirdly, there's a lot of peer pressure around you that everyone's doing it and you have to do it too. So in the case that obsess is a choice, it is not. It is largely coercive that you have to act publicly with the nature of your faith. Why is that dangerous? Because a lot of the time, for people who've been constant victims of hate crimes, for people who are the most vulnerable and therefore cannot act in public professions of their faith because they live in areas that are incredibly discriminatory, because they're sacrificing a job in the instance that they do this, they are already put in incredibly vulnerable situations. Moreover, the threat of hell, the threat of religious shame and guilt is put upon them. I would note, the ability to reinterpret it from religious leaders is likely to ensure that they don't feel that same kind of guilt. They don't feel like they're people who will go to hell and are dangerous and bad people overall. They are already put in bad physical situations, but the spiritual nature of their existence is also harmed insofar as they feel like they are sinners. These are the most vulnerable groups of individuals we ought to protect. In the instance that they say other people might feel guilty, I'd say this is the group we ought to prefer in terms of protection. I think the guilt only occurs if OO says that these people are unlikely to be able to believe religious leaders. I'd argue a few things. One, as a minority group, you probably only have few sources of the religion, and therefore these are incredibly powerful religious leaders because they're most proximate. But two, insofar as all religious leaders are likely to do it within Europe, it's likely to be an incredibly believable narrative, and therefore the guilt is not as large as opening opposition points out to be. Lastly, I would say even for the spiritual exercise of your religion, it is dangerous. Not just because I think OG just says, it's not great, you can't practice your religion if you're beat up. I mean, sure, but let's not be as simplistic as that. I think it is better insofar as your religion does not entail a large degree of self-sacrifice. There's that people feel like they have to choose between themselves and their physical well-being versus them wanting to be able to practice their religion. Not only does this mean either people leave an incredibly important point of solace if they feel like they have to choose between themselves and their religion, and therefore being attacked is unideal. But secondly, I'd say a lot of people internalize the attacks, the things that are happening to them are acts of faith. And therefore they must be able to carry them out and only continue to be victims of these kinds of things. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech and invite the member of opposition to present their case. Here.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Fabulous. Okay. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. I'm going to solve the top half deadlock. I'm going to talk about the importance of identity, and I'm going to talk about the splintering of religious groups and why that's harmful for those individuals. Starting off with it, solving the top half deadlock, the stuff about, like, you know, changing opinions. In the absence of iconography or definite images, e.g. the hijab or the cross, etc., to figure out what is a person's identity, you define it through preconceptions, particularly those who have racist inclinations or more likely to engage in these kinds of things. So for instance, if I see Jack with a mustache and a tweed suit, I think he's one of those like South Dublin posh wankers. So as a result of that, we then know that the people in these particular areas have certain preconceptions of Muslims or other minority religions within that country. And those are, if government are true, are 2 things. First of all, there are pernicious, evil stereotypes of those religions. But secondly, there are things like skin color, accent, name, language, etc. What that means then is 2 things. Firstly, it means that discrimination is largely symmetric, because even if someone isn't wearing a hijab at school, they still get bullied for being a Muslim. Their parents, or the parents of like the white kids, tell them not to play with them, etc., because they still perceive them as being a Muslim. But secondly, and more importantly, confirmation bias means no actual change on 2 respects. Firstly, non-Muslims or people that are not a member of the discriminated against minority religion, when they're displaying the negative traits associated with that religion, get lumped in with that religion, and then still people then like build up their conception of that religion based off it thereafter. But secondly, and more importantly, Muslims who are able to pass, for example, don't get conceived of as such. So for instance, like a doctor or something like that. Then the reason which opening opposition miss for why this actually like gets to meaningful change is that the majority of people within these countries, their racism and their discrimination is subconscious. They don't conceive of themselves as a racist. They conceive of themselves as just someone who's being rational, engaging in normal things. When you challenge these preconceptions of these individuals, it changes how you think of the group thereafter. So that's the mechanism by which you get this kind of structural change. It's the reason why government bench don't actually get their impacts on it. So that deals with top half and to large extent CG. I also note that it's also true for CG's populism material, because to the extent that the populists within that country have a particular agenda based off of, you know, whatever, they're still able to play up these stories that, you know, X, Y, Z, A, B is happening, all the things the closing government wanted to talk about, you know, like these people are stealing your identity, these people are, you know, changing what it means to be French or German, etc. They can still do those things, even if they're not necessarily based in truth, right? Because that's the whole point of a populist idea, is that it's not necessarily based in truth. So unless you think, CG, that they're right, you must then also believe that in the counterfactual world, things will be roughly similar. But I'll get on to more material on that later. Identity then. The expression of identity is the source of meaning and utility in life. Opening opposition kind of hint at this, but they don't give the actual analysis. Here's 5 reasons. Firstly, utility is the transference of your conception of yourself into the actuality of yourself. So for instance, even the most simple version of that is, if there was a piece of food on the table and I'm hungry, I want to be someone who is not hungry, so I then transfer that I eat the piece of food and then become not hungry. Secondly, and it could be more things that are more complex, like for instance, if I want to be the kind of person who reads books, I will then read books and then get utility from the reading of those books, because I'm bringing my conception of my identity more in line with my actual physical expression of the self. Secondly, when this transference has an ideological basis, it brings not just utility, but meaning. So note that all sources of meaning in life, like career, music, and religion, are all things that are conceptive, right? They're ideas you have about themselves rather than physical things that you're just like, you know, eating food, drinking water, etc. So that brings meaning into these people's lives, when oftentimes they will have none in the kind of factual. And thirdly, most simply, utility is ascribed to people onto things and then realized, right? So like, I mean, I might have placed a significant value on a particular concert that Jack doesn't like. And therefore, when I go to that concert, I get more utility out of it. It's based off of identity, right? It is my identity that I ascribe the utility based off of. It is transferred through my identity by which I receive it. Fourthly, most simply, festivals, ceremonies, public experiences, those kind of things that OG want to talk about essentially banning, are all really enjoyable experiences for people. Then fifthly, and this is important, but it's a bit complicated, is you mediate your own identity through its expression of others. So, right, you bounce it back off of others. If you are no longer expressing your identity, you conceive yourself as being interacting with someone else. So for instance, actors kissing in a play isn't as important, for instance, as, you know, you kissing the love of your life, because they're not kissing you as you, they're kissing you as someone else. Moving on then to splintering of churches, of religious groups, because that's why identity is actually important. The expression of it is actually important. Moving on to the splintering of religious groups. Kind of say, they will become radicalized, but the analysis there was, I think, a little bit like weak. Here's 3 reasons why this will splinter religious groups, or 3 pieces of context. So, firstly, many religious people weigh their religious identities more highly than their physical identities and perceive it to be linked to absolute truth and eternal life. CG's mechanism is here. Secondly, many religious people do not do this, right? So, especially younger people, young professionals, etc., who are like only culturally religious because of increasing secularization. Note these people oftentimes will opt out of religious expression anyway, so they don't get their harms of these people facing direct discrimination. Thirdly, there are potential areas of splintering already, not only along like the radical versus secular lines, but like you get like Muslims together from 15, 10, like 20 countries, all with potentially different like vernacular languages, different cultural religious links, different interpretations of the Quran. On the status quo, they're all together in the one community and one church. But when you introduce this contentious piece of like religious material, that's more likely to splinter those groups, right? Or like that can play up those tensions. Before I move on to the impacts of the splintering, OG.
Utility and meaning in these communities are largely defined by their religious leaders. If religious leaders give confessionals example for not being able to wear a burqa outside, why is a person going to feel so traumatized as you claim?
Yeah, so the thing about this then is like, I know that you wrote that POI before I just gave those three things, but those are the three like structural reasons as to why there will be a disparate interpretation amongst people, because it is not as though the imam is the absolute source of epistemic authority within that community. They are an interpreter, but they are not absolute, particularly in these specific areas. But Jack will get into more response on this later. So why is splintering important? Three key things. Firstly, the best case scenario for use here is that these people stay at home rather than going to church if they feel like the church is no longer speaking to them. That means two things. Firstly, the mutual social capital that they were getting from the church previously allowed for jobs and social mobility that they couldn't get otherwise. Similarly, secondly, friendships and emotional support can provide, like financial support, emotional support, those kinds of things. The second key respect then is intra-community religion. So if they split along cultural lines, e.g. like a Ghanaian mosque and like an Ivory Coast mosque, these things have the same effects. They can create tensions between those groups, but they also lower the amount of social capital that those groups have. But thirdly, and more importantly, they fracture along radical lines, right? If like the radical sections of the church decide, oh, we are going to now like start our own splintering church, it means firstly, more radical people get more radicalized and get their expressions reformed, which means more violence, so good materials out. Secondly, the concept of Muslims then gets defined by these groups, so losing all of your optical material. And thirdly, and importantly, these radical churches can then radicalize people better than other things because they feel like they are speaking to their emotional identity. We say, we are speaking for you, we understand you. So because identity is vitally important for people's understanding and meaning in their life, and because splintering is far more likely to occur, please oppose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech and invite the government whip to present their case. Here. Speaker for that fine speech and invite the opposition whip to present their case. Here.
Just one sec. Perfecto. Sorry. That's you. Right, starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Frankly, panel, Dylan's already won the debate before I do any mitigation on top of what Dylan already did. Because splintering is more important than anything in the sort of point of class on like practical effects on the community, because you often rely on your community for things like jobs, for a sense of helping each other, more than you rely on an outgroup, which would be the source of discrimination, as Dylan points out when he talks about the nature of these communities, and even as OG points out when he talks about how these communities are so close-knit. At the point at which then that is true, that means splintering actively harms your ability to provide for yourself and protect yourself then, more than upping or like more than increasing or decreasing discrimination. So I went on the practical stuff, but that wasn't even our main focus. Dylan also just went straight away when he talks about why identity is so important, right? The fact that it is something inherent to every single source of utility. Rather, it is a tantamount to discrimination to yourself to do something which you don't associate with, to something you think is antithetical to your identity. The point to which that is true, that, because it is certain, overrides all probable discrimination that government rely on for harms. Right. 2 points of clash in this debate. First of all, what's in the interests of the congregation? And second of all, on expressing faith. What then is in the interest of the congregation? We heard stuff about stopping these people from being targeted from both OG and OO. Note, Dylan gave you the response that you are often like ascribed characteristics, which you will then realize is why you then target people when they no longer publicly display their faith. We had a response to this from Ignacio that you're not going to target people because they are, say, Middle Eastern. You're going to target them because they're Muslim. But this is a complete misunderstanding of Dylan's analysis, right? He points out the fact that they are Middle Eastern is why racist bigots think they are Muslim and they are still attacking them because they're Muslim, not because they're Middle Eastern. Insofar as that is true, we still get that pretty much symmetric amount of like discrimination. But moreover, we think on both the issues of assimilation and populist rhetoric, because that's simply just a flip side of assimilation, but then also targeting generally, we think, one, bigotry is irrational, right? It's not something where bigots, because sort of CG have this like this idea that, oh, bigots will be standing around thinking, oh, look, they're not publicly expressing their faith anymore. We love these guys. No, for fucking decades, you've been whipping up fucking racist, filthy ideas about these people who are good people, but you don't care because your bigotry is inherently irrational for it to be so hate-filled. And so far as it's irrational as well for people to believe in it, it's probably quite dogmatic. It's probably something that is central to them. They're trying to associate with their national identity, as Miko points out. And so far as that is true, just because people start slightly changing their behaviors, that isn't going to make these people who are already irrational fucking bigots start looking at that rationally and change their minds. We think that's ridiculous. But moreover, on signaling of assimilation and how politicians relate to this, is that politicians simply have an active incentive to whip up this racist rhetoric. So even if people start expressing faith left, they will still say they're stealing their jobs. They'll maybe focus on other cultural practices which are different. For example, they don't like our food, they speak different languages. We think that a separatist displays of faith can still be linked to these groups and these communities. As far as that is true, you probably still have significant targeting, significant hit on assimilation. Note though, weighing OO in congregation as well, just sort of weighing it vertically, because I think their case is sort of just killed by Mika when he points out there's no productive interaction. But no, Dylan points out that we actually gain any benefit from contact through the idea that Dylan points out is insofar as there isn't benefit, there isn't productive interaction, people begin to realize their biases, right? They begin to realize how they are discriminating against people and the unconscious biases they do have when they come into contact with these groups, and those biases become conscious and open in front of them. That is the point at which then people can begin to change themselves and begin to not become racist, which means then if someone applies, say like a Muslim person then applies to their job, they will then be likely to hire them. So discrimination is actually changed through contact, but not the way OO claim, because CG put that very well, but rather the way Dylan points out, where it makes people realize their own biases. Right. I think as well, they do give responses to our splintering, because I've already pointed out why splintering wins this interest of congregation stuff, so I'll deal with those responses. They talk about this idea that there's essentially, you can still express your identity, so it's going to keep people together, at least in private spheres. Note, this is a complete misunderstanding of Dylan's analysis. It was never about actually expressing your identity, rather being told to not express it, being told that this is not the way we should conduct ourselves, especially not in public. If this is something at least some people in this community hugely believe in and have done for their whole lives and is likely internalized, that is definitely going to cause splintering regardless. This just completely nukes all of the responses that Ignacio gives, the point to which he's reliant on this misconception of Dylan's analysis, and therefore the splintering is standing. Note as well, he talked about the fact that maybe splintering is only marginal because there's other sources of splintering. We think the nature of splintering is that it is either absolute or not. So yes, while there may be generational or maybe some like sort of country-based divides, we think when there is something that is uniting them together, that can still prevent other splintering from occurring. When this sort of gets rid of that linchpin, which is this being how you were told to express your identity, that is then what causes the final splinter, which will then cause ruptures in the community, which means them not able to depend on each other for jobs, which they need to do so, as both OG and Dylan point out. I'll take a POI from OG quickly before I move on to expressing faith.
The motion says all religious leaders are going to tell their communities to do this. So why would splintering occur if everyone in the community is doing
because okay, if you were told to jump off a bridge, you're not going to be like, oh, this is great, because this is something which is so internal to their fucking identity that they're not going to be happy when their religious leader does it. Some people who may be more moderate within that religion, or maybe say younger people, will listen to the leader, but older people where there's already some possible lines for splintering, the potentiality is there, that then is actualized when you actually divide these people along those lines. Right, on expressing faith then, OO talk about how this is deprivation to identity. They this is responded to well when there's simply ideas of like you're told how to do this from your religious leader. This is the real big response that we get to anything on faith from government bench at all. But note, this is still something which is internalized to you. And I think this is important for actually taking out Miko's analysis on removing guilt, because there's this idea of guilt being inherent in religion. But note, we simply, this isn't true, and this isn't how people engage in religion for 3 reasons, or it's going to be symmetric for 3 reasons. 1, not all belief is negative. Rather, you're not wearing a burqa because you don't want to go to hell. You're wearing it because you want to express your religious identity. It is actually positive action. But secondly, we think these are things that are simply so internalized, right? These are things you have done for your whole lives. This is the way you've grown up and been raised. You see this essential to your identity. This is essentially maybe a coerced learned preference over time, but the point at which your religious leader then goes against that, that's probably 1, very alienating to your sense of self, and 2, very confusing, which is this thing you have associated with your religion and associated with yourself because that's the way you've been raised. As far as that is true, you're going to feel guilt on either side of the house, but also because 3, religion is inherently individual. It's about how you conceive your conception of self in relation to the supreme. So far as that is true, when you don't engage in religious behavior, you're going to feel guilty internally, regardless of what others say, taking out Miko's analysis. But past that, we hear responses from Ignacio how these are really social things. Even if they are social, they're still part of your identity, which are being removed, and the analysis Dylan gives still applies. Vote CO.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. I request all of you to leave the Zoom call and wait on Discord.